My wife stared at the judge and said she wanted everything. House, cars, savings, my Navy pension, just not our son. I told my lawyer, give it all to her. The courtroom went dead silent. I'm Aaron Mitchell, 58 years old, and for a moment I could hear the old ceiling fan in the hallway clicking like a loose propeller on a destroyer I once served on. Even the bailiff stopped shifting his weight. Judge Harold Thompson's pen hovered over the paperwork like it had forgotten how to move. The only sound was that damn fan and my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. Carol sat up straight in her navy blazer, hair done the way she wore it for her MLM success photos. Smooth, bright, perfect, like everything else she'd been chasing lately. She didn't look at me like a wife who'd spent 28 years watching me come home with concrete dust on my boots after my Navy retirement. She looked at me like I was an outdated piece of equipment she'd finally decided to replace. On her side of the table, her attorney Diana Foster tilted her chin with that quiet confidence lawyers get when they think the math is simple. House, cars, accounts, retirement benefits, and the one thing Carol didn't want to deal with anymore. Our son, Brian. My attorney, George Anderson, leaned toward me so close I could smell his coffee breath and the faint scent of Old Spice he'd been wearing since Vietnam. He whispered through gritted teeth, "Aaron, this is completely insane. She's overreaching big time. We need to fight this." I didn't turn my head. I kept my eyes fixed on the corner of the table where someone had scratched a tiny anchor into the wood years ago. I felt the weight of the courtroom pressing down, the way you feel the weight of a ship's hull when you're standing in the engine room during a storm. Everything above you held up by structures you can't see, hoping they don't fail when the pressure gets too much. "No," I said, my voice steady. George's gray eyebrows shot up like he'd been slapped. "Give it all to her," I repeated, calm enough that my own voice surprised me, like I was ordering coffee at the base commissary back in Norfolk. Carol's lips twitched. Not quite a smile, more like the satisfaction you see on someone's face when they finally get what they've been scheming for. Like she'd finally gotten what she believed the world owed her. Judge Thompson cleared his throat, the sound echoing in the suddenly quiet room. "Mr. Mitchell, I need to be absolutely certain you understand what you're agreeing to here." "I understand perfectly, Your Honor," I said. Because I did. Better than anyone else in that room. You see, people think a retired Navy engineer spends his civilian life looking for problems in other people's construction projects. Faulty wiring, cracked foundations, systems breaking down under stress. But the truth is, after 22 years keeping ships running in every kind of weather the Navy could throw at you, plus another 8 years supervising construction crews, you develop an eye for structural problems. You can't turn that analytical thinking off. You walk into your own kitchen and notice the way the floor dips slightly near the refrigerator. You see that hairline crack snaking along the drywall and tell yourself it's nothing, just normal settling. That's exactly what I'd been doing with my marriage for the past several years. Telling myself it was just settling, just normal wear and tear. Judge Thompson looked down at the thick file again, flipping through pages with the careful attention of a man who'd seen too many lives torn apart in his courtroom. "And you are also agreeing that your wife will retain the marital residence at 2148 Maple Ridge Drive, both vehicles, and the substantial majority of joint assets, including retirement accounts. You will retain personal property as itemized and primary custody of your son, Brian Mitchell." Carol made a small sound, something between a laugh and a snort. Brian was 19 years old. Technically, the court didn't have to decide custody the way it would for a small child, but Carol had made her position crystal clear anyway, right there on the official record, like she couldn't help herself from saying what she really thought. Everything except the son. That phrase didn't just land in the courtroom. It hit me in the chest like a piece of shrapnel from an explosion. Brian wasn't a piece of surplus equipment you could decommission when it didn't fit your new operational requirements. He wasn't government property you could transfer to another department because you were chasing a different assignment, a different life. But Carol had already decided he didn't fit the picture she wanted to post on her business success Instagram account. Judge Thompson's expression softened for just a moment, and I caught a glimpse of the man behind the black robe. "Mr. Mitchell," he said, speaking slower now, more carefully. "Is anyone pressuring you into this agreement? Anyone at all?" I looked at Carol directly for the first time since we'd walked into this courthouse. Her eyes were dry, steady, beautiful the way they'd always been, even when she was being cruel. Especially when she was being cruel. "No, Your Honor," I said clearly. "No one's pressuring me into anything." I signed the page they slid across the polished table toward me. The pen felt heavier than it should have, not because it was difficult to write my name, but because of everything that signature represented. Years of naval service, years of building something solid, fixing things that were broken, trying to do right by my family even when it wasn't easy. Carol watched my hand move across the paper like she was watching money transfer between bank accounts, calculating her profit margins. When I finished signing, I set the pen down gently, like it might shatter if I dropped it too hard. The hearing wasn't really the end of anything. It was more like a watertight door closing, and I'd already walked through it in my mind months earlier, because this whole mess didn't start in that sterile courtroom with its fluorescent lights and cheap wood paneling. It started 9 months earlier at 2:15 in the morning, with the blue glow from Carol's phone lighting up our kitchen like a sonar screen on a submarine. Back then, 9 months before that courtroom, I still slept in the same bed as Carol. Still believed our life, plain, steady Ohio normal, was solid enough to weather whatever storms came our way. I'd gotten up for water that night. Nothing dramatic about it. Just the way you do when you're 58, and your bladder doesn't have the patience it used to have, and your knees remind you of every deck plate you ever crawled under in the Navy. I padded down the hallway in my socks, past the gallery of framed photos that told the story of our family. Brian at 8 years old, holding up a bluegill he'd caught at Cedar Creek Lake, grinning like he'd landed a marlin. Carol and me at a Dayton Dragons Game 3, summers back. Both of us sunburned and smiling, sharing a bag of peanuts. The kind of photos that make you think you really know the people in them. The kitchen was dark, except for that phone light. Carol sat hunched over the table, thumbs moving fast across the screen like she was operating some kind of critical equipment. She didn't hear me approaching at first. The air carried the faint scent of her face cream. Lavender, expensive, something she'd started buying after joining those Facebook groups full of women talking about transformation and financial freedom and living your best life. I stopped in the hallway, not trying to spy exactly, just pausing because something about the way she held herself looked different, secretive, tense, like she was trying to keep something important from spilling out. The message on her screen wasn't hard to read from where I stood. Big white letters against a black background. "Can't wait to see you build your empire, beautiful. You're going to be absolutely unstoppable once you cut the dead weight holding you back." Then another message popped up. "Your husband doesn't understand your potential. Real entrepreneurs have to make tough choices. Winners take risks." Dead weight. That's what I was to her now. Dead weight. My throat went completely dry. My heart started doing that thing where it tries to hammer its way out through your ribs, the way it used to during emergency drills when the alarm would sound at 3 a.m. and you'd have to be fully dressed and at your station in under 4 minutes. Carol smiled at that phone screen. Not one of her polite, social smiles. A real one. Genuine. The kind I hadn't seen her aim in my direction for longer than I wanted to calculate. I backed away from the doorway without making a sound, then turned and walked back down that hallway like my legs belonged to somebody else entirely. In the bathroom, I stared at my reflection in the mirror. I looked exactly like what I was. An older guy with crow's feet starting to dig in around his eyes, graying at the temples, shoulders still broad from a lifetime of carrying heavy responsibility, but with a bone-deep tiredness that no amount of sleep seemed to fix anymore. I went back to bed and lay there in the darkness, while Carol slipped in beside me about 20 minutes later, phone face down on her nightstand, acting like she'd just gotten up for a glass of water, too. She smelled like that expensive lavender cream, and something else I couldn't quite name. Something that felt like deception. The next morning, I didn't confront her about what I'd seen. That might sound like weakness to some people. Maybe it was. But I've been in enough emergency situations where people panic the instant you point out a critical problem. They start arguing, blaming other systems, slapping quick patches on things that need major repairs, painting over water damage instead of finding the actual leak. That approach doesn't fix anything, it just makes the eventual failure more catastrophic. So I did what the Navy had trained me to do for more than 2 decades. I started conducting a systematic inspection. Not of her phone again, not right away. I started inspecting the life we'd built around me. The way Carol talked differently now, the way she dressed, the new patterns of behavior that didn't match the old baseline readings. Carol had begun treating our home like it was inventory for something she called her business empire. She'd started referring to it as building assets, like that fancy language made everything she was doing sound more legitimate and professional. Carol's MLM adventure had started small, the way these things always do. "Just a few products to get started, Aaron," she'd told me, waving her hand like she was shooing away a mosquito. "People pay serious money for this lifestyle transformation. It's just temporary inventory until the business gets established." Temporary turned into permanent real fast. The first thing that disappeared from our house was the nice throw blanket that Brian's grandmother had crocheted by hand, the one with the intricate cable pattern that had taken her most of a winter to finish. Then our good reading lamp vanished. Then the dining room set I'd personally tightened every bolt on after Brian spilled chocolate milk all over it when he was 5 years old. Our living room started looking like military housing after a surprise inspection and mandatory equipment turn-in. Sparse, functional, empty of anything that made it feel like home. The good couch disappeared completely one Saturday, while Brian and I were out at AutoZone picking up parts for my old Ford pickup. When we came back, there was a cheaper love seat sitting in its place, the kind that sags in the middle like it's already given up on life. Brian stood there in the doorway, with his backpack still slung over one shoulder, just staring at the room like he was trying to solve a puzzle with half the pieces missing. "Where's our couch?" he asked. Carol breezed in behind us carrying a Starbucks cup, grinning like she'd just closed a major business deal. "It's at a client's house for a staging consultation. This one works just fine for now." Brian's eyes found mine. He didn't say what I knew he was thinking, that our house was being stripped down piece by piece, and somehow his mother was acting like this represented progress instead of loss. I swallowed my anger because I didn't know where to direct it yet. "Okay," I said, "as long as it comes back." Carol laughed, a sharp sound. "You worry too much about stuff, Aaron. Things are just things." But it wasn't just the couch, and it wasn't just things. I started noticing boxes in the garage, stacked neat and organized, taped shut and labeled in Carol's precise handwriting. Premium wellness products, success tools, investment inventory. The kind of labels that made everything sound important and legitimate. I started noticing the way our joint checking account would dip at odd times throughout the month. Not like groceries or gas or normal household expenses, but like somebody was making large purchases in a hurry, buying things they thought would make them rich. Then I saw it. Not at 2:15 in the morning, not in a secret text message, I saw it in the one place you absolutely cannot lie to a man with my background and training: official paperwork. The college fund statement came in the mail on a Thursday afternoon in October. I'd gotten home early from a site inspection, a strip mall renovation downtown with electrical problems that made my skin crawl. I was tired, my lower back was stiff from crawling around in tight spaces, and I did what I'd been doing for years. I sorted through the mail methodically at the kitchen counter. The envelope was thin, official-looking. Brian's name wasn't on the return address, but I recognized the investment company logo immediately. We'd been contributing to that account for over 15 years, never missing a month, sometimes throwing in extra when I picked up overtime work. I opened it expecting to see the usual modest growth, maybe enough accumulated to cover Brian's junior year expenses. The balance was drastically lower, not a little lower, $18,000 lower. My first thought was some kind of clerical error, a computer glitch, something that would get straightened out with a phone call. Then I saw the transaction line, printed in cold black ink. Transfer out, authorized withdrawal. The date was from 6 weeks earlier. I stood there in my own kitchen, the same kitchen where Carol had been smiling at those dead weight messages, and I felt something fundamental shift inside me, like a critical support beam finally giving way after carrying too much load for too long. That money wasn't just numbers on a statement. It represented 15 years of cutting corners, skipping vacations, driving cars until they literally wouldn't start anymore. Also, Brian could get his education without drowning in debt the way too many kids do these days. And Carol had taken it like she was borrowing a tool from the garage. I heard her car pull into the driveway, heard those expensive heels clicking across the concrete like she was walking into a board meeting instead of the house where she'd just stolen her own son's future. I slid that statement back into the envelope and set it down carefully on the counter. Not because I was afraid of confronting her, but because I suddenly understood with perfect clarity exactly what was happening here. Carol wasn't just leaving a marriage. She was systematically stripping our entire life down to the bare essentials and planning to sell off all the valuable parts to fund whatever fantasy her MLM mentors had sold her. And I wasn't going to stop her by yelling or pleading or trying to reason with her. I was going to stop her the way the Navy had taught me to deal with any system that was threatening the safety of people under my protection, by documenting everything carefully and letting the facts speak for themselves. 2 weeks after finding that college fund statement, I discovered she'd also been making early withdrawals from my Navy pension. Small amounts at first, a few hundred here and there, then bigger chunks. The penalties alone were enough to make me physically sick. I called my old shipmate, Pete Kowalski, who'd retired the same year I did, and now worked as a benefits counselor for veterans. We met for coffee at the Panera near the base. "Aaron," he said after I'd laid out the whole situation, "what she's doing, taking pension money without consent, that's not just morally wrong. There could be legal implications here." I nodded. That lined up with what my gut had been telling me for weeks. "You need to document everything," Pete continued. "Every withdrawal, every transfer, every purchase. And you need to talk to a lawyer who understands military benefits." That's when I called George Anderson. I'd known George for almost a decade from the VFW Fish Fry Committee. Solid guy, Vietnam era, understood the way military people think and operate. We met at Murphy's Diner off Route 48, the kind of place with cracked vinyl booths and coffee strong enough to wake up a submarine crew. George listened while I talked, laying out the financial picture the same way I'd brief a commanding officer about a critical systems failure. When I finished, George leaned back and studied my face. "Aaron," he said slowly, "she's asking for everything in this divorce. Everything. I know we can fight this, and we can probably win." "I'm not here to fight," I said. That stopped him cold. He stared at me over his coffee cup. "Then what exactly are you here for?" "I need to know how to let a failing system collapse without taking innocent people down with it." I told him about the MLM scheme, about the affair that was obviously happening, about the way Carol was treating Brian like excess, cargo she couldn't wait to jettison. I told him about the boxes in the garage, the furniture that kept disappearing, the way she'd started talking about deadweight and tough choices. George sighed deeply. If you push back hard right now, she'll dig in. Legal motions, delays, attorney fees that'll bleed you dry. She'll fight dirty because she thinks she's fighting for her new life. I nodded. That matched my tactical assessment. And if I don't push back? I asked. George hesitated, choosing his words carefully. Then you might lose everything that shows up on paper. I looked down at my hands, thick fingers, scarred from decades of mechanical work, steady enough to operate complex equipment under pressure. Hands that had maintained critical ship systems, built structures that were still standing, steadied Brian when he was learning to walk. Everything that shows up on paper isn't the same as everything that actually matters, I said. George watched me for a long moment, recognition dawning in his eyes. You're planning something. I'm planning to stop holding up a structure that's already failed, I said. I just need to make sure the collapse happens safely. That earned me a slow nod. All right then, George said. We document everything, and we wait for exactly the right moment. Carol filed for divorce 3 weeks after I found the pension withdrawal records. No tears, no dramatic confrontations, just signatures on legal paperwork, and a look on her face like she was finally stepping into the Instagram life she'd been promised by her MLM mentors. The months leading up to the final hearing were strange. Carol moved through our house like she was already gone, making lists of everything she planned to take, posting more and more photos of herself at business conferences and leadership retreats. She stopped asking what Brian and I wanted for dinner. Some nights, she didn't come home at all. Brian noticed everything, the way kids do even when they're technically adults. He'd sit at the kitchen table with his textbooks spread out, working on engineering homework, occasionally glancing toward the door like he was waiting for something normal to happen. Dad, he said one evening while we were eating leftover pizza off paper plates because the good dishes had been borrowed for a staging project, is Mom really going to take everything? I looked at my son, tall now, serious with Carol's eyes but my stubborn jawline, and chose my words carefully. She's going to take everything she wants, I said, but that's not the same as everything that matters. Brian nodded slowly. He understood more than he let on. During those months, I kept documenting. Every MLM purchase, every mysterious withdrawal, every credit card statement that showed spending patterns Carol couldn't possibly explain on legitimate business expenses. I photographed the garage inventory, the product boxes stacked floor to ceiling. I researched the MLM, company's compensation structure, their legal problems in other states, the class action lawsuits from distributors who'd lost their life savings. George Anderson helped me understand the legal framework. The beauty of what she's doing, he explained during one of our coffee meetings, is that she's insisting on taking complete ownership of all business assets. That means she also takes complete responsibility for all business liabilities. What kind of liabilities? I asked. George smiled grimly. Let's just say that when someone accumulates $95,000 worth of inventory, credit obligations, and tax exposure, ownership of those assets becomes a double-edged sword. The morning of the final hearing, I stood in our empty living room one last time. The walls echoed when I cleared my throat. The cheap replacement furniture looked lost in the space where our real life used to be. But I didn't feel angry anymore. I felt something much more powerful. Certainty, which brings us back to that courtroom, to Judge Harold Thompson asking if there was anything further from either side. Carol leaned back in her chair, arms folded, victory smile already spreading across her face. Diana Foster started to shake her head, already thinking about her next case. That's when George stood up, smooth as silk. Your Honor, we respectfully request that the court acknowledge the attached exhibits submitted with the settlement documentation. Carol spun toward Diana so fast I thought she might give herself whiplash. What exhibits? She demanded. Diana frowned, grabbing her copy of the settlement papers from the table. She flipped through quickly, then more frantically. Her professional composure started cracking like ice on a pond in spring. Diana? Carol's voice had gone up half an octave. Diana kept flipping pages, color draining from her face with each one. Your Honor, she said, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. I need a moment to review these documents. Judge Thompson raised his hand. Ms. Foster, please explain the issue. Diana stood up abruptly, her chair making a harsh scraping sound against the polished floor. Your Honor, the attached documentation appears to indicate significant, undisclosed financial obligations tied to the business assets my client has just agreed to accept in their entirety. Carol's victory smile died completely. Aaron, she said, her voice sharp with accusation, what did you do? I met her stare calmly. I signed exactly what you asked for. Judge Thompson leaned forward. Miss Foster, please be specific. Diana's composure finally shattered. Your Honor, these exhibits detail business inventory obligations, credit card debt, outstanding vendor payments, storage facility violations, and potential tax liabilities totaling approximately $95,000 in direct obligations that transfer with the business assets. The courtroom buzzed with whispered conversations. Carol shook her head frantically. That's impossible. Diana, you said everything was clean. You said this was straightforward. Diana spun toward her, panic making her voice sharp. I reported what you showed me. These documents indicate obligations you never disclosed, credit applications filed jointly, inventory purchases on shared accounts, tax exposure from unreported business income. Carol sank into her chair like she'd been shot. This isn't fair, she whispered. I just wanted what I earned. Diana kept reading, her voice rising despite herself. Storage facility lease violations, potential IRS audit triggers, vendor contracts requiring payment regardless of sales performance. Your Honor, my client has just accepted legal responsibility for all of this. Judge Thompson's voice cut through the chaos. Mrs. Mitchell, you certified that you were accepting these business assets with full knowledge of their value and obligations. Is that correct? Carol looked at me one final time, searching for something. Mercy, maybe, or regret. What about him? She said, pointing a shaking finger in my direction. He gets away with everything? Mr. Mitchell relinquished ownership of these assets, Judge Thompson replied firmly. Legal responsibility follows ownership. You insisted on complete control of these business interests. The gavel came down with a sound like a ship's hatch closing. Carol left that courthouse with everything she'd demanded. The house, the cars, the accounts, the business, and every single dollar of debt that came with it. Her MLM mentor stopped returning her calls within a week. Her Instagram posts became less frequent, then stopped entirely. 6 months later, Brian and I live in a small rental house that feels more like home than our old place ever did. We make pancakes on Sunday mornings, box mix, too much butter, the kind of simple ritual that holds a life together. Brian's talking about maybe joining the Navy after college, and I tell him that decision is entirely his to make. People sometimes ask if I feel guilty about what happened to Carol. The honest answer is no. I didn't create her debts or her poor choices. I just stopped holding up a structure that was already collapsing and made sure I was standing in a safe place when it finally came down. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is know exactly when to let go, and trust that the truth will carry its own weight without any help from you.